In April 1993, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 819. It declared the eastern Bosnian town of Srebrenica and the 30 square mile area around it a United Nations safe area. The promise was unambiguous. The international community would protect the civilians inside. They would be safe. 2 years later, in July 1995, Bosnian Serb forces under General Ratko Mladic walked into Srebrenica unopposed. Over the next 72 hours, they systematically murdered 8,372 Bosniak men and boys. It was the largest mass killing on European soil since the Second World War. The UN peacekeepers who were there to protect them had stood aside. Srebrenica wasn't just a massacre, it was a fundamental failure. A case study in what happens when a peacekeeping mandate collides with a military force that has no intention of keeping the peace. To understand how Srebrenica fell, you have to understand what was defending it and what wasn't. The UN Protection Force, UNPROFOR, deployed a Dutch battalion, Dutchbat, to secure the Srebrenica enclave. Approximately 450 to 600 lightly armed peacekeepers drawn mainly from the Dutch Air Mobile Brigade. They were equipped with YPR-765 armoured personnel carriers, which were essentially an upgraded M113 with a 50 caliber machine gun, plus a handful of anti-tank guided missiles. Their rules of engagement were restrictive. Their mandate was peacekeeping, not combat, and not peace enforcement. Outside the enclave walls, the Bosnian Serb Army, the VRS, had assembled the Drina Corps, between 1,500 and 2,000 troops, tanks, artillery, mortars. Commanded directly by General Ratko Mladic, a career military officer who had already spent 3 years prosecuting a brutal ethnic cleansing campaign across eastern Bosnia. Inside the enclave, roughly 40,000 Bosniak civilians had crowded into Srebrenica, many already displaced from surrounding villages already cleansed by Serb forces earlier in the war. The Bosnian government defenders, the ARBIH's 28th Division, were poorly armed, undersupplied and exhausted. The UN arms embargo on all of Yugoslavia, intended to de-escalate the conflict, had the practical effect of preventing the victims from defending themselves, while the VRS inherited the Yugoslav People's Army's arsenal. The foundation of disaster was already in place. A peacekeeping force without the mandate or firepower to fight, a civilian population with nowhere to run, and a besieging army with every incentive to act before the international community could react. The assault began on July 6, 1995. It unfolded over 6 days, and at every point where the UN could have intervened, the system failed. July 8th, Bosnian Serb forces overrun UN observation post Foxtrot, one of Dutchbat's key early warning positions on their southern perimeter. The Dutch soldiers retreat. Bosniak civilians, desperate for protection, block the road and beg them to stay. In the chaos, a civilian throws a hand grenade at a Dutchbat vehicle and a Dutch soldier is killed. 30 Dutchbat troops were taken hostage by advancing Serb forces. July 10th. The shelling intensifies. Refugees pour north towards the main Dutchbat base at Potočari. Colonel Tom Keremans, the Dutchbat commander, files his first formal request for NATO air support. Close airstrikes on Serb artillery and tank positions. It is rejected by the UN Force Commander, General Bernard Janvier, in Zagreb. Karaman requests again that evening. General Mladic himself is now up on the hillside above Srebrenica, personally directing the operation. Janvier finally approves air support, then postpones it until morning. Keremans tells the town's civilian leadership that 50 NATO aircraft will strike at 6 o'clock. July the 11th, the defining day. At 9 a.m, Colonel Keremans is informed his air support request was submitted on the wrong form. He must refile. NATO aircraft, airborne since dawn, are running low on fuel and need to return to their base in Italy. The Serb shelling resumes. More than 20,000 refugees, women, children, elderly, flee towards Potočari. At 12:05, Janvier finally authorises strikes. At 14:40, 2 Dutch F-16s dropped 2 bombs on Serb positions. The Bosnian Serbs threaten to kill their Dutch hostages and shell the refugees. Airstrikes are abandoned. 2 bombs. That was the sum total of NATO's military response to the fall of a UN safe area. At 16:15, General Mladic enters Srebrenica and claims it for the Bosnian Serbs. And then the separation began. Mladic summoned Colonel Keremans to the now infamous meeting in the Hotel Fontana. He demanded the surrender of all weapons. He assured the civilian representatives, "You can survive or you can disappear." The next day, July 12th, Bosnian Serb soldiers, using stolen UN vehicles, equipment and uniforms, began separating men and boys aged 12 to 77 from the women and children. A Dutch-based soldier watched a civilian taken behind one of the houses near the base, forced to kneel against a wall, and shot. 23,000 women, children and elderly were forcibly deported over the next 30 hours. The UN paid for the fuel for the buses. Meanwhile, roughly 15,000 Bosniak men, knowing what awaited them if captured, formed a column and began a 63-mile march through hostile territory toward the nearest government-held town, Tuzla. They were shelled, ambushed and hunted. Thousands were killed in the hills. Those who were captured were taken to collection points: a warehouse in Kravica, a school in Bratunac, a football field in Nova Cabasa. Over 72 hours, Bosnian Serb forces executed 8,372 men and boys in what international tribunals would later rule a genocide. They buried them in mass graves. And when it was over, on July the 21st, General Mladic bid farewell to Colonel Keremans. He gave him a gift, a bottle of whiskey. Keremans smiled, accepted it, and asked, "Is this for my wife?" Both men laughed. They shook hands. Mladic saluted as the UN vehicles departed. Dutch-backed troops were later seen celebrating, having left Bosnia. The first reports of the massacre were already emerging. The UN's civilian head for Bosnia, Yasushi Akasai, failed to report them. Colonel Keremans described the attack that had just enabled a genocide as an excellently planned military operation. Srebrenica exposed a gap in the international order that nobody wanted to acknowledge. The UN had created a safe area on paper, but refused to supply the forces or the mandate to defend it. Peacekeeping assumes that there is a peace to keep. In Srebrenica, there was no peace. There was only a besieged civilian population, a hostile military force, and 450 lightly armed peacekeepers caught between them. The failure was not the soldiers on the ground, though their conduct afterwards was indefensible. It was the chain of command. Every request for air support was delayed, deferred or denied. General Janvier in Zagreb and the UN civilian leadership prioritised the safety of the peacekeeping mission over the safety of the civilians it was sent to protect. When Mladic threatened to kill the Dutch hostages, NATO stood down. The hostages were released unharmed. The civilians of Srebrenica were not. The Dutch government eventually acknowledged partial responsibility. In 2019, the Dutch Supreme Court ruled the state 10% liable for the deaths of 350 men who were expelled from the Dutch-backed compound and handed to Serb forces. 10%. That's the price a state paid for being present at a genocide and not stopping it. The structure that failed in Srebrenica, a UN mandate without enforcement power, a peacekeeping force without combat capability, a civilian population used as a bargaining chip, would reappear in different forms in Rwanda, in Darfur, in Syria. The question Srebrenica asked, what does never again actually mean, remains unanswered. The Srebrenica genocide lasted 72 hours. 8,372 dead. The largest mass grave in Europe since 1945. Perpetrated on UN-protected soil. Enabled by a peacekeeping force that was not equipped, not mandated, and ultimately not willing to fight. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia ruled the killings a genocide. Radovan Karadzic and Ratko Mladic were both convicted of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. Mladic is serving life imprisonment. But the broader institutional lesson is this. A peacekeeping mission is meaningless without the means and the mandate to enforce the peace. When the Security Council draws a line on a map and calls it a safe area, it is making a promise to every civilian inside that line. In Srebrenica, that promise was broken. And the people who paid the price were not the generals, the diplomats, or the politicians. They were the 8,372 men and boys who believed the UN meant what it said. If you enjoyed this video, hit like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.